Welcome. I'm Ron Baker, Director of the Canadian Small Church Ministry Center, and this is us,
Yeah.
Canadian Small Churches in Action podcast. And today we have a special guest. I've been looking forward to this. This is going to take me both in directions related to bivocational, multivocational, and intercultural, and just so many things that I'm looking forward to. But I should let him introduce himself. And if you can just tell us a bit about who you are, what your name is, what's your ministry background, just sort of get us started on getting to know you a bit, that would be great.
That's awesome. Thanks, Ron. My name is Jeremiah. I serve as a church planter in Ontario, in the city of Brampton. Myself and my wife, we planted this church 3 years ago. And if I were to sort of go in reverse, prior to that, we did a church planting apprenticeship in the city of Guelph with a church plant there. And prior to that, we were doing our own schooling. I became a follower of Jesus through Power to Change Ministries at York University, then called Campus Crusade or Campus for Christ back then.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's been a wild journey. I had done my undergrad in philosophy, and the tradition seems to suggest that many Christians that take that course end up leaving the faith, and I did the opposite, I guess.
Good.
But that was the first step of what has led myself and my family here. We have 2 children. Aruna is 2 years old, and Theodore is a month old, actually.
Wow.
So interesting time in our family for sure.
Yeah, I'm sure glad you're awake.
Yeah. I have coffee, which I will be sipping
good.
If that's okay.
That's great.
Just to stay awake. Myself and my family have also ventured into starting a small business in immigration. So I am a regulated immigration consultant. As a church plant, our desire is to always be in that space, reaching out to new immigrants and new Canadians coming into this country. And I thought this would be a good way to sort of co-vocate and have 2 jobs, I guess, that are related to one another and feed into each other as well. So as needs arise and as we get more educated as to how we can serve people coming into this country, I'd love for our church to be a part of that service and maybe engage more people in it as well. Yeah.
Well, you threw out some words that are interesting to me right now, just because of a number of discussions that are going on. You said to co-vocate. The words bivocational, multivocational, all of these things are sort of coming into place with church ministry. And I think particularly recently with smaller churches becoming a much more, well, whether we call it a small church or a branch of the larger church or whatever, the small church leadership and pastoring seems to need this more than one vocation. Can you throw out a few thoughts on that as to what you're seeing and how you're seeing that happening?
Yeah, and I mean, if I were to peel it back a little bit in my own life experience, I grew up in the Middle East, and whether you were a large church or a small church, the pastors usually were always bivocational.
Right. Yeah.
So I definitely understand that it might be something new in North America, in Canada, and the United States for a pastor to have multiple vocations, especially in larger churches. But this is definitely something I grew up with. My first pastor was a travel agent, and the other one was an accountant.
Okay.
And they preached.
I had fun. I had some Filipino friends who came to me and says, "What, you guys are single vocation in a church? How do you do that? We've always been multivocational," or whatever. Yeah.
It seems to be the way things sort of work in especially out east. Churches get no funding from the government. They sort of run themselves, whether they are like whether they're registered or not is another question. Can you register in some countries?
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's the church sort of takes care of itself. And when I learned that, churches here get government grants for certain things, like, wow, like this is amazing. But yeah, it's definitely not the shared experience. So as I think about the introductory word is bivocational, I guess. And as you sort of delve deeper, people have come up with a few more definitions to clarify their positions and what they're doing. So bivocational basically translates to like doing two things,
Jobs. Yeah.
two jobs. So a pastor would be one vocation, and the other vocation could be something that is usually very different. So I've had it described to me that many pastors that are doing bivocational ministry do something completely different from their regular pastoral work. It could even sometimes be described as mindless. So I've served along people that are pastors of churches and bus drivers for their local schools, sort of like taking them out of their regular element into something else. So from there, you sort of develop an idea around like two vocations that are sort of similar and sort of feed into each other is what we call co-vocational. So these are for people like me. I don't like doing mindless things, or I like doing things that are fairly connected and can sort of flow into each other and make sense and be organized in my own mind. So in my case, a church plant that wants to reach immigrants, and me being an immigration consultant, they sort of co-vocate into each other. And it also, for a lot of pastors, it could look like being authors or teachers and in other situations outside of their church, and having that income and experience flow into their ministry of the church. That's how I would define co-vocational. Multi-vocational is a new term that I learned.
It's kind of a, well, let me give you some of what I'm doing. I retired so I could become multi-vocational.
There's no such thing as retiring. Yeah.
I agree. So I serve as a librarian in a college. I'm also a professor. I'm an interim pastor at the moment. I write for our local social media.
Yeah. Man, I've always growing up looked forward to retirement, and like I don't think I'm in the right vocation.
I don't think you are at all
to get to that point. No, man. Yeah. I actually met a pastor that was multi-vocational just a few months ago. I'd never heard the term before, but this is a guy that has his hand in like 5 different things and is also pastoring. And they're like each experience is very different. And I think while definitions help, it's also not constraining. People can definitely be creative. The end goal, even if the end goal is the same, whether you're a single vocation pastor or not, the end goal is to serve the church and build God's kingdom. And I suspect that there is going to be a growing reality in Canada that bivocational, co-vocational, multi-vocational pastors are going to need to rise up, just in terms of the realities of the world we live in, and seeing threats to charitable statuses being taken away, and giving going down in many ways, churches closing. In many ways, I think people are a little concerned and scared, especially Christians, specifically Christians. But it's also an interesting opportunity to see what God can do in spite of what the world is throwing at the church. Like the promise is still the same, like no weapon fashioned against the church can stand because of Christ and what he's done. And we get to be a part of it. We get to be a part of that battle. And it's sort of what I'm used to, because like in most places in the world, either you're not allowed to worship Jesus. Where I'm from, where I was born in Kuwait, we were only allowed to worship Jesus on a specific place in the country.
Mm.
And if you were caught like having a prayer meeting or a church service anywhere else, like you could be imprisoned.
Yeah.
So it's interesting because like I see people worrying, but at the same time, I'm so blessed to have the experience of seeing church plants planted in places like India and the Middle East, and seeing God do amazing things too. So something to look forward to as well.
Now you bring a real optimism to, I think, what has become a very clouded vision across Canada in churches, where we're sort of talking about, oh wow, we're not going to have the freedoms we used to have. We won't have the funding. We won't have, and I think your voice is an important voice in the midst of this, just to talk about optimism.
Mm-hmm.
And what have you seen in your ministry or in ministries related to this whole area of optimism in the midst of, I guess people call it loss of freedoms. I'm not sure that's the right term, but
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I mean, especially during this COVID season,
yeah,
I think we've seen the church's under the surface division come to the surface a lot more.
yeah,
Um, and you're seeing polarized opinions. You're seeing facts being thrown around in different ways and interpreted in different ways for the purpose of different things. I'm sad to say that I feel like we're borrowing from our friends down south and working to be very bipartisan, even though that's not the type of government or politics that we represent in this country. Yet like you have your conservatives, and then you have people pointing fingers and saying, oh, you guys are liberal, and
yeah,
all that kind of stuff within the church. And so that is definitely new for me. This is not to say that in my life experience that churches weren't divided, but as I mentioned, like we had one place in Kuwait that we could worship, and so Christians from every denomination you can imagine and every
yeah,
ethnicity you can imagine had to have their own expressions of worship, but then also had to learn to work together, and serve together and do things together. And so that's something I'm looking forward to. That's an optimistic thing that I'm looking forward to. I'd love to see the church be more united instead of fragmented. That could be a positive thing that comes from minor persecutions, I guess.
yeah.
Mhm.
In fact, I could see that as a great thing, where we've talked about in the last number of years breakdown of denominations, but maybe we still carry denomination, is that the right word, or emphasis or foci
Mhm.
that relate to who you are, but at the same time you're working with many other people.
Mhm.
And how do you do that well?
I don't think there is a specific way. It is through the grace of God and the leading of His Holy Spirit.
Yeah,
Unfortunately, yeah, like we are broken people, and in the midst of that, in the midst of thinking that you're, securing true theology for, the things that you believe in and stuff like that, you do that in the same jest. You point fingers and call heretics of the people around you. Um, I don't think that like the tribalism or tribism that we have within the church is necessarily going to end. Um, but at the same time, I think we're going to find opportunities to serve together,
yeah,
to do things together in the in the with the interest of serving Jesus, worshiping Him, and building His kingdom. Will it be perfect? No.
mm,
Has it ever been perfect in my experience? Definitely
no,
not. Um, but at the same time, I think it opens up other opportunities. I think for the most part, we're looking at everything that we're going to lose. once all of these rights and freedoms are taken away. The other way of thinking about it as well is thinking about what could God do with
Yeah.
this new reality. How could God is going to continue to build this kingdom. He's won the war, but we get to be a part of this kingdom building mission. I was trying to describe this sort of position that the church is in that, like, God has won the victory, so what are we doing? And I found this analogy in World War II after D-Day, after the storm of Normandy. The Allies won the war, but for many years later, the soldiers were still going through all of Europe, especially Germany, fighting battles, dying, struggling. Just because the war was won didn't mean the work was done. And I see that as being the reality of the church right now. Is, yes, Jesus has won the battle. He's defeated death. He's defeated sin, and we get to be part of that inheritance. But we still have work to do. And we're going to suffer through it. Some of us are going to fall, but not die, thanks to what Jesus has done. And as Jesus had told us that, in this world we will go through trials and tribulations, but fear not, I have overcome the world. And that's the promise that you sort of have to embrace as we look forward to what God is going to do in Canada. And I personally, I thank God for my experiences, and thank God for showing me things that I didn't even recognize at the time before I was a Christian. But I think still holds true. And there is still hope, in spite of the fact that your government charitable status might be taken away. There's still hope, with the reality that they could try restricting what we say and what we do. I think if you haven't thought about it already, churches should be thinking about being more independent, and not needing help from the government. It's a very rare situation where you actually get that in the first place. So yeah, those are some of my thoughts. I know it's a bit scattered. I'm a philosophy major.
That's very, philosophy is, okay. So, let's go back to the question of co-vocational, bivocational, multivocational. What do you find are the pitfalls of that approach? There's lots of advantages I can think of, but
I was actually speaking with a gentleman. I was casting vision for, I was support raising for the church plant, and I was invited to speak at a church, and I got to share a little bit about church plant, preach a sermon, share my testimony. And this gentleman, after hearing that I was considering going bivocational, co-vocational in order to help sustain the church plant, help the dollar stretch a bit more for a church plant, he actually took me aside and said, no matter what you do, don't stop ministering the gospel. And he started crying. And I was like, what's going on? Like, this guy was like, a big, tall Dutch man, and you just don't normally see that type of reaction. And I was a little bit frozen, didn't know how to react. And I asked him, this seems to be like bringing up a lot of emotion. Is there a story there? I'd love to hear. And he told me that he was a pastor and he sought to go bivocational, but he let the second vocation take over, and he gave up his pastoral ministry because it offered more stability. It took more time and concentration to get his business off the ground. And once it did get off the ground, he couldn't manage two things, and he gave up his pastoral ministry. Now, in the grand scheme of things, that could have been God's design or whatever it might be. But I think if you ask me for a pitfall, I think a big part of it is distraction.
Okay. Yeah.
A big part of it is finding comfort in other things. I think one of the one of the interesting things about small churches and church plants and church revitalization projects and stuff like that is, you in a very keen sense don't know what tomorrow brings. And um, in spite of the fact that the church of God will never close, churches do close, local churches do. um, and so there's this temptation to want something more steady, and you think about things like family and
Yeah.
caring for their needs and all those types of things, and it's easier. um, at least what I learned from this gentleman's story was that he feels like he made the wrong decision.
Mm.
He proverbially fell into a pitfall, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah.
um, So I think distraction, allowing comfort, the I guess the lies of comfort to sort of take over God's desires for um, what He wants you to do, what He's calling you to do. Um, yeah, I think those two things come to mind for me. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm very young in it. I'm still very much learning. And I'd love to say that, like, I don't see myself falling through those pitfalls, but I would be lying. um, it's just through the grace of God and continuously abiding in Him and keeping our focus on the kingdom that we're looking to build here with God, but also in the kingdom to come. Um, yeah, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
We rely on the Holy Spirit daily.
Okay. I'm, you brought up about many more questions that I'd love to ask. We've got just a few minutes left, so maybe I'll go at one or two of those questions. You talked about how multivocational, bivocational, there's the opportunity either to find a mindless second job or
Mhm,
to find a coordinated, interrelated.
mhm.
Can you speak to both of those as to how they can work? I think they both can work, but yeah.
Yeah, I guess mindless is a bad way to define
No, that's, I
but
agree with you. Mindless is probably a good thing sometimes.
it could benefit the church planter or pastor in a great way, because I think there's a finite amount of emotional resource that people have, and I think just doing something that's completely different could benefit a certain personality.
Yeah.
um and so, whether it be um whether the person is driving a school bus or is a barista at a coffee shop or whatever it might be, these are still great opportunities to get to know your community
Mhm.
um, in a different context, um, and invite people into the life of the church, whether it's through their Sunday service or things they do during the week. These are still really good opportunities where those things still do connect, even though the vocations are kind of separated.
Yeah.
um, and the realities for a co-vocational for me made a lot of sense, because I can't think separately about things. It makes more sense for me as far as my jobs are concerned, that they do relate. And so as I'm thinking about one, I'm also thinking about the other
Right.
and how they feed into each other. um, and the opportunities there are that, like, the specific um, aspect of the society or community that you're trying to reach, you're well informed about. I
Mhm.
have the opportunity as time goes on to be extremely well informed about the needs of immigrants,
Yeah.
about, um, you know, it, part of my job is to help them get here, but what happens when immigrants get here,
Yeah.
right? What are their needs? How can a church or a group of churches come alongside and say, like, hey, like, we want to help you assimilate into Canadian culture. We want to help you learn about how to deal with Service Canada.
Yep.
how to get your driver's license, even rudimentary things like what does it look like to invest for your retirement? Because in many places, we don't really think about that, or we don't think about it in the same way. You sort of shore up different things for the end of your work life in different ways than we do here. But if you're going to live here, you need to think about those things. Um, how do you buy a home? What are the best strategies around that? There are just so many things that people that have lived here a long time could help newcomers and new Canadians. Yeah, like either way, the end goal is to build a church. The end goal is to serve the community, loving our neighbors, and the hope and desire is that, like, one of the biggest things I think there's a disconnect between church leadership in the form of your vocational pastor and everyone else is there.
Laity. Yeah.
I mean, I one of my supporters serves on the board of the Canadian Christian Business Association. And she was saying that, like, she was getting more and more disappointed as to what she was hearing in the midst of COVID from the pulpit. It just seemed very disjointed and not connected to what was actually happening in the life of business owners and the life of employees and stuff like that. What a co-vocational and bivocational sort of pastor has in his pocket as well is that they're very much in and more connected to and are going through the similar things that that regular people are going through.
Yeah.
And so when I think of writing a sermon, or someone like me thinks of writing a sermon, they're not as disconnected and can speak to real things. And this is not to say that, like, pastors, primary vocational or single vocational pastors can't. I just think it becomes a little bit more real and something that you're going through and can speak into what it looks like to rely on God when your business is not doing well.
Yeah.
When you've lost employees or you've lost your job, that type of thing. It just provides another opportunity there too, I think. Yeah.
Well, you're kind of stepping into the last question that I had sort of set up for this interview, which is and maybe I'm going to bias your answer here, but if you could give one piece of advice to a small church pastor, what would that be?
I don't know that I'm qualified to give any advice, but at the same time, I would say, before any advice, like, small church pastors are my heroes. Since becoming a Christian, I never understood, like, the fads that we have as Christians. I remember going to a conference for the first time. It was the first conference I've ever been to. It was in the States, and they had your A-list people there.
Yeah.
I brought a non-Christian friend with me so that he could hear the gospel and experience, like, Christian community and stuff like that. And we went to a main session where I heard a pretty prominent preacher preach, and I actually really liked the way he spoke. Like, he spoke through emotion, and my friend really connected with him too. So we decided to go to his breakout session after, and there was this huge lineup of people trying to get in. I didn't know how popular he was. I didn't know anything about him. And then I saw people, like, cutting into the line and causing fights and creating new lines that didn't exist just so that they could get into this particular breakout session. I was like, what is going on? like, we want to hear about Jesus. Jesus is the hero of all of these stories, yet you're acting like imbeciles in the process. And my friend was actually put off by it. I'm still walking alongside of him, and he's still curious, but that that experience was in his life was a little bit of a dampener as to like what Christians could look like. And so for me, I remember reading a book by D.A. Carson about his father, who was a small church pastor, and served faithfully without maybe having the recognition that a larger context pastor would have. And so to me, as I church plant, I'm realizing that, yeah, like the recognition may not be the same. You may not necessarily feel the impact that your that your work is doing as much, and you can get disenfranchised with what you're doing. Maybe it's not worth it. However, if God is calling you to this specific church, continue doing what you're doing. Let the Holy Spirit give you the strength, and don't look at the metrics that we generally tend to look for, which is butts and seats and money in the bank and all of these different things. Your service might look like serving 10 people or 12 people or 20 people or 50 people for a long time. And if you're serving God in the midst of it and serving others, again, you're my hero. Because at the end of the day, when we meet our Lord, the last shall be first and the first shall be last. And I think of the small, like, village pastors in places like India. I think of people that, again, are bivocational, are doing this because they love Jesus and are not necessarily making any money from it. I think of a particular person that I met in India who serves in the red light district, preaching the gospel to prostitutes and pimps. I remember going and visiting, and he asked me to teach, and I was like, I want to learn from you.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, what I want to learn, like, what drives you, and I want to feed off that same thing. And I mean, his answer was kind of rudimentary but still powerful. It's God. It's his Holy Spirit. And sometimes that, because we don't have a good sense of what that is, that doesn't seem to be enough for us. And my advice is, abide in Jesus and let his love actually be enough. Let it be what satisfies what you do and how you serve others, and don't think about anything else. Yeah.
Okay, unfortunately, the time is up. But having said that, I have just so enjoyed this. It comes around to a number of things that I've been thinking and dealing with. And here I'm in a rural situation. I get to see a lot of, okay, I could talk and talk too, but we need to close this. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ron, for having me. Sorry that I say a lot of things for too long.
Oh, no, I really enjoy it. Thank you very much.
Thanks. God bless.